Hi everyone, Valohna Wynn here from Safe House of the Desert. Welcome to art class today. So, as you know, I use art as a wonderful medium to express emotion and use it for therapeutic purposes. So today what I wanted to do is I wanted to teach you some quick different finishing techniques that you can use as you're getting creative at home or in shelter. And we're going to be using a lot of different paints, but for this particular portion, I'm going to talk about acrylic paints. I use for Michael's Craft Smart paint. It's inexpensive. You can get it in a big tub for I think $20, and you have all of the colors to work with. And it's a great way to get started doing something creative. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the table down so that you can see some of the materials I'm working with, and then I'm going to show you some techniques that you can use for your own art projects, okay? So hold on, here we go. All right, so what you're seeing on the table at this point is bits and pieces. I'm going to adjust this a little bit more. There you go. So what we have is we have a whole bunch of different types of paintbrushes. These again, I could get at Michael's or an inexpensive craft store. But what's interesting about the brushes here is that I want you to take notice that there's different tips on them. Flat nose. This is another flat nosed. I thought I had an angle board. The brush tip is actually angled, and that gets in corners really nicely, which is kind of cool. And then we'll get to round nose brushes. These are lovely for big broad strokes and calligraphy. And the flat type of brushes, these guys are great for just laying paint down on the canvas and doing detail work. Now I also work in sponges using this type of a sponge brush, or using this type of kind of a kitchen or a car sponge that I get from the 99-cent store. And I cut it up in a whole bunch of pieces. So additionally, there's another thing we'll use when we're playing around, and that is an old toothbrush. And I'm going to show you some of the things we'll be doing with that. Also, we'll be working with cellophane so that you're able to do some interesting patterning. And I'll be using a handy dandy, going all over the place, a handy dandy ink pen, so to work with my art after it dries. So I'm going to get started. The first thing I want to show you is the strokes that we're working with in terms of the paint. One is, when you're using the paint, I want you to use it really sparingly. One is, you can always come back and add more. Okay, you can always come back and get more paint. But for this moment, when we're all trying to figure out if we have a job or if we're going to continue to work, using your material sparingly makes a whole big difference. There's only a couple of rules in my class, and the first rule is that you express yourself in a beautiful way. And the next rule is that, for gosh sakes, don't get paint on the carpets, nor on the floors, nor on your furniture. Because what happens is, when you get creative, you get busy. And so we want to be able to maintain the integrity of the spaces that you're working within, to be able to keep them from trashing your home while we're having fun, or getting on things in the shelter. So I've got a couple of little quick palette of paints. Here's the first thing. One is, if you're working with a flat nose brush, when you lay the paint down, it's going to create a nice tight line for you. So you can literally get a good coverage of paint and go back to it. So straight nose is going to give you very precise lines. Let's say you're doing something that's got a lot of squares and stuff in it. This is a great brush to be able to maintain the integrity of your shape. An angled nose brush, I call it an angled nose, but it's just an angle brush. You're able to really get creative with big lines and small resolves. Literally, this brush, if it will give me lines like a straight brush, but I also can add small line to it, which is kind of fun. Okay, so that's kind of an angle brush. Smaller detailed brushes, the smaller the tip of the brush, the more fine that it gets. So let's say that I want to add little tiny dots to whatever I'm working with. This is a great brush for repetition on patterns. It really works out really super well. And you can go back into the paint where it may not be completely and utterly saturated, and you can go over it, and all of a sudden you have this wonderful little ladybug type thing that's working. Okay, so that is just a fine, brush tip. Now here's something as well that's interesting. So now, if you want to do something interesting with textures, what you can do is, if you have this sponge, you can do a couple things. One, you can use this sponge, or we can use this one. I think we'll start here. So let's say that you want to do an ombre type thing. What I'm going to ask you to do is we're going to put 2 colors of paint on the brush, and then you're going to do one stroke going one long direction. And what happens is that you get this seamless, you can kind of close up on that, you get a seamless finish for ombre. And that's using a foam brush. Now let's say we are doing the same thing we want to do, but we want to do it with a different type of foam type of sponge. What am I saying here? Okay. You're going to go in and you're going to get, let's say now we're going to do maybe 3 colors. Here's a way to be able to get modeling of colors. And they kind of mix. Sponges like this kind of give you like this really kind of interesting texture that kind of gives you almost the feeling of a universe. And so I like using these type of sponges because they can be washed out, and they're just easy to manipulate. If you want to add in another color, you add that in and you just layer it. And what happens is you get kind of this really neat kind of clouded effect, versus the difference between the brush, the foam brush, was very direct, but the sponge kind of leaves you with a mottled finish, which is really kind of neat. Now this is great when you're doing something like, let's say we're going to be doing the Universal Soul, and you want to create a whole space type of experience. This type of technique where we're dabbing and we're going around and around and around, this creates a really neat finish for that type of experience. So let's say now that we wanted to put stars or something. You can take an old toothbrush and you literally can do this. And what it'll do is it's going to put pieces of little stars all up in your painting. We're going to experiment here in just a second. Normally, you can add it in for a little texture. This toothbrush actually does more texture than it does stars. I'm going to show you a different way to do stars. But if, let's say you had a cluster and you wanted kind of to cluster some texture in there, an old toothbrush is a great way to do it, because you can cluster it in and then you can brush it out if you want to have some kind of interesting wispy stuff going on. Okay. Another way to do stars is dip your paint in a brush that's rigid. It might be like an old brush that you've got, and then you just literally do this movement with the paint, and what it'll do is it's going to throw, let's see if we can make it do it. I think this might be too soft, but it's going to throw some sort of speckling and stippling into what you're doing. Kind of messy, but if you have an old brush, I would suggest that you use an old brush over something that's brand new. Now here's another little trick. Let's say that you want to do finishes that are, let's say they feel like they want to be old wood. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pair of scissors and I'm going to cut this brush all up. And I'm going to create inconsistencies in the tip of this brush. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of colors and I'm going to lay down these dragged lines. This is called dragging. And what it does is it leaves, see how it's leaving breaks in the lines? This is really a neat way to create a different texture where you're using an old ragged brush. And this could be an old brush that's dried out that you were going to throw away. Well, you can chop it all up and get like these interesting lines. So it's a whole different way of doing that. Now for the last thing I want to show you real quick, this is another way that we can have fun. And you take cellophane. Now don't bunch it up too much. You don't want to munch it because what we're looking for is to see that it has some texture. So I'm going to roll it in all of this paint. And then we're going to see what we get. And what we're going to get is we're going to get, it looks like leather or it looks like an abstract texturing. This is done with all the paints on the right now. It looks, see how it looks almost like confetti? That's what's really fun about using cellophane or any kind of plastic wrap that you've got that you can use it. It creates a great texturing so that you can then go back in and create a whole new kind of overlay outside of this texturing to create an interesting piece of art. So what you have here is you have 3 different types of art where you can do, well actually more than 3. You have dragging, you have ombre, you have the use of the paintbrushes for what they're designed for, nice clean lines, and then lines that go small to large using your angle brush. And then this is using that yellow sponge, and that can create a universe. So if this was all black and purples and blues, it would look like a solar system, and then I could take the brush and I could put in the stars, and all of a sudden you have a solar system. So that's a little bit about what we're doing with a simple, easy paint techniques here with Lady V and virtual art. I hope you're having a great day, everybody, and enjoy the process. Play, get curious, look at materials, and also use materials unexpected for patterns. All right, guys, I'll see you next time.